Altogether fitting and quite proper that Richland College concludes its salute to Theodore Roosevelt with an address by the executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association of Oyster Bay, New York, Dr. John Allen Gable. Dr. Gable, a native of Illinois, received his baccalaureate degree from Kenyon College in Ohio and his PhD in history from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Since 1974, Dr. Gable has served as the executive director of the TR Association, as well as the editor of the Theodore Roosevelt Association Journal, which is published quarterly. He is the author of the highly acclaimed The Bull Moose Years, Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Party, as well as numerous articles and reviews. He is currently serving as Adjunct Associate Professor of History at the C.W. Post Center of Long Island University, and as the Executive Director of the TR Association. He also serves on the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Committee of the American Museum of Natural History and the Theodore Roosevelt Collection Committee of Harvard University Library. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to welcome this distinguished historian and Roosevelt scholar to Texas, to Dallas, and especially to Richland College. His topic is Theodore Roosevelt, Images and Reality. Dr. Gable.
Thank you, Bob. It's a great privilege to be here, and I have been in the last couple of days very impressed with your campus and with the students I met and with the faculty. You really have a place really that you should feel very proud of. Now today, I'm going to speak first about the historiography of Theodore Roosevelt. Now that refers to the images. Historiography is the history of history. In short, I'm going to talk at first about the history of those people who have written about Theodore Roosevelt. And then I'm going to turn to what I call the reality behind the images and talk about some aspects about Theodore Roosevelt that I think that you have to take into consideration when evaluating him as a person and as a leader and as a historical figure. It seems to me that the historiography of Theodore Roosevelt has gone through about 5 different periods or phases. We are now in the 5th, the history of TR in 5 phases. The first period was that period immediately after his death. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858 and died in 1919. And the first period may be dated from 1919 to 1931. There were many biographies of Theodore Roosevelt written in this period, a great many poems, many monuments erected, and the whole keynote of this first period of TR's historiography was that he was a great hero. My predecessor, who was director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, the first director, said that Theodore Roosevelt belongs, quote, to the heroic line. And he compared him to the prophet Ezekiel, to Olaf the Sea King, to Charlemagne, to Cromwell, and to Natty Bumppo. I mean, here we're talking about a hero larger than life. And perhaps most symbolic of the view of this period is the fact that TR was put on Mount Rushmore, very much larger than life. This was a decision made by Gutzon Borglund, the sculptor who had been a member of TR's Bull Moose Party and who really worshiped TR. Interesting thing about the biographies written about TR in this period, and there were quite a few, a good dozen. In this first 10 years, there are often a number of books written right after a man dies, is that a lot of the men who wrote these books were pretty good historians, pretty good writers, pretty solid people. But in almost every case, their book about TR was like the worst one they wrote. One reason for that was that they lacked the perspective of time. It was just too fresh, this experience. And many of them had known TR personally as friends because he knew most of the great writers and historians of his own time. And then, of course, they didn't have the benefit of years of scholarship and research. You know, the different articles, the different books on the various situations that TR faced, on the Panama Canal and so on. Today we have the benefit of generations of scholarship, of articles on all the various points of his career, on conservation, on the Pure Food and Drug Act, on the Panama Canal, and various aspects of the foreign policy. They didn't have this. Also, they didn't have access to the private papers and letters, the collections of TR's contemporaries. They had TR's papers. He gave them to the Library of Congress before he died, and he was very open about that. But it took, since he wrote letters in the hundreds of thousands, it took a staff, finally, of about 6 or 7 people, about 7 years, doing nothing else just to read his correspondence. And most of these boys got out their books pretty quickly to meet the popular demand. And, of course, many of his contemporaries were still alive, so they couldn't read their correspondence files and so on. In short, they lack perspective, and these books do not stand up well. They're just kind of hero worship. And perhaps the best stuff that comes out of this period is not the history books, but rather the poetry and the monuments. Mount Rushmore, rather than William Roscoe Thayer's biography of T.R., for example, or Kipling's poem, Greatheart, rather than Joseph Buckland Bishop's biography of T.R. And Rudyard Kipling, the great English poet and writer, who was a great friend and admirer of T.R., wrote the poem Greatheart when T.R. died in 1919, and it pretty well sums up the viewpoint of T.R.'s own generation about him. Concerning brave captains, our age hath made known, for all men to honor, one standeth alone. When Greatheart passed over, all the trumpets sounded on the other side. Now here is a great hero. Then we come to the second period. We can date this very precisely as beginning in 1931, because that was the year that Henry F. Pringle's biography of Theodore Roosevelt was published. Henry F. Pringle, P-R-I-N-G-L-E. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's still in print. It's still available in paperback after 50 years. It's a brilliant book from the standpoint of prose, from the standpoint of conception and design. It's brilliantly put together, very well crafted. It's really a masterpiece of the historical art. And it is still today perhaps the most famous, surely one of the 1 or 2 most famous books ever written about Theodore Roosevelt. And Pringle saw Theodore Roosevelt not as a great hero, but it's quite the opposite. Not a devil. The opposite of the hero really is not the devil, you know, because the devil can be big and strong and somehow compelling or awe-inspiring, right? No, the opposite's a clown, buffoon, somebody you laugh at, somebody you don't take seriously. And Pringle saw T.R. as a perennial adolescent, somebody who never grew up, whose career was often amusing but seldom marked by solid accomplishment. And then we see an interesting variation on that theme brought to the stage, of all things, in Arsenic and Old Lace by Joseph Kesselring in 1941. How many of you have seen Arsenic and Old Lace? But it is, quite a few of you, it is one of the most performed plays in all of American history. By the way, it was the only play that Kesselring wrote that was a success, and it's been performed many times. And of course, in that, T.R. is shown as literally crazy, because of course it really isn't T.R., it's a crazy man who thinks he's T.R., and T.R. is seen as basically a lovable, eccentric, crazy buffoon. Of course, also in the 1930s, the accomplishments of FDR, cousin Franklin, Theodore Roosevelt's 5th cousin, married to his niece Eleanor, began to eclipse the Roosevelt record of the earlier period, because FDR passed so much legislation and so on. What was not noticed until later, of course, was that many of the measures passed by FDR had first been proposed by the man FDR called Uncle Ted. And we have going on down still further attacks on TR. I think one of the most important and one of the attacks that really shows us where this period is at. This is the second period. This is the period we should call the debunking period. That was the phrase coined in the 1920s by W.E. Woodward to express what that generation of the 1920s and 1930s like to do, debunk, remove bunk, you know, and they did it with many historical figures. This debunking period, I think the nadir of it, the low point really is Professor Dexter Perkins, who in 1937, he's one of the great historians of foreign policy, American foreign policy. And he is indeed a great scholar, and that's why what he said had such weight. He said that TR, in effect, was a liar. So it had come to that. And here was now a man who was a buffoon whose word you could not trust. Now, what that was all about was that in 1902, a German fleet appeared off the coast of Venezuela. Germany was owed debts by Venezuela, and Germany sent the fleet there. TR later said this about 13, 14 years after the event, that he had called in the German ambassador privately to the White House and said, because this is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, I don't care what your case is, what your excuse, the justice or merits of your situation, we can't have European troops landing on foreign soil. And of course, everyone knew, TR knew, that the whole thing was a put-up to help the Germans get a base in the Caribbean, military base in the Caribbean, naval base, and to help expand their own empire. I mean, they gladly loaned the Venezuelans the money and, of course, gleefully hoped they would default so they'd have an excuse to invade. At any rate, so he told the German ambassador, he told this to an historian about 13 years later, he said, I told the German ambassador, you tell the Kaiser he's got, and the period of time was given, I forget what it was something like 2 weeks. He's got 2 weeks to get those ships out of there or Admiral Dewey will blow them away. And so then the ambassador goes away, a few days pass, and the ambassador returns. TR says, what did Berlin say? The ambassador said, Berlin does not take this seriously. Berlin does not have its policy dictated from Washington. Berlin does not believe that you could mean what you say. TR said, well then, if that's the case, then my old deadline of the 2 weeks doesn't matter, and you now have 48 hours. Within 48 hours, the German fleet was gone. Not a shot was fired, and the Kaiser announced that he was willing to submit the dispute with Venezuela to arbitration. TR then issued a public statement praising the Kaiser as a wise statesman, so on and so on. He never told anything in public about what he'd done about the ultimatum until like 1914 or 15. Problem was, at that point, World War I was on, and of course TR was very much an opponent of Germany, so many people questioned his credibility. And Perkins had looked through a lot of archives and didn't find what he considered sufficient evidence. So he said that TR's account of the 1902 Venezuela affair was, quote, inaccurate and untrustworthy. In short, TR was a liar. Yeah, he just made this up, an old man bragging, blah, blah, blah. There wasn't sufficient evidence for the situation. And then we come down to one of the most brilliant historians, I think the most brilliant historian, particularly in terms of coming up with ideas that have been very useful. The most brilliant historian of the generation that taught me was Richard Hofstadter, in my opinion. And Richard Hofstadter's very influential book, The American Political Tradition, in 1948, the chapter on TR very much summed up this whole debunking school of historiography on TR, and he called TR the master therapist of the middle class, a conservative who pretended to be a reformer, quote, a man with the intellectual fiber of a muscular and combative Polonius. Quote, in retrospect, it is hard to understand how Roosevelt managed to keep his reputation as a strenuous reformer, unquote. This from one of the greatest historians, I think, of his generation. So TR has fallen a long way from Mount Rushmore. And by this point, by the way, a number of people are asking, how did they put him up there anyway? Why does he belong with Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington? Now, let me just turn for a minute to the Pringle biography. Let me give you an example of how he worked. This is what he writes about the Spanish-American War, TR and the Spanish-American War. Quote, he led his men against a hail of inaccurately aimed bullets. Presumably they were inaccurately aimed because they didn't hit TR or something. Actually, let's look at the facts here. The Rough Riders had a 37% casualty rate, which was the highest of any regiment in the war. There were 490 Rough Riders engaged in the Battle of San Juan Hill, and 89 were casualties, either killed or wounded. Well, at least 89 bullets were not misaimed, you see. But you see, the point is to denigrate, to somehow make the whole thing a little stupid and foolish. So big deal, he took San Juan Hill, so what? They weren't aiming right that day. The way to discredit it. Here's something far more serious. Those kind of snide comments, that kind of use of adjectives characterizes throughout Pringle's book. Now, If you turn to the first edition, you'll find on pages 458 through pages 454 through pages 458. 4 pages of the book. 4 pages are devoted to a rather pathetic little story about a woman named Mrs. Bellamy Storer. Now, Mrs. Storer was the wife of TR's ambassador to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She was a very devout Roman Catholic, and she liked to play church politics. And she attempted to get the Pope to name Archbishop Ireland of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minneapolis, a cardinal. And, you know, she was lobbying around down in Rome, and she said that that's what TR wanted. That's what the president wanted. The president wanted Archbishop Ireland to be a cardinal. Well, this came out in the press, and TR denied it, and actually he liked Archbishop Ireland. It was well known that he liked Archbishop Ireland, but certainly it's not his business of the President of the United States to tell the Pope who we should name as cardinals, and he wasn't getting mixed up, and this was a very silly, foolish woman. In the end, TR had to remove her husband because his effectiveness in the diplomatic corps had been destroyed by this whole incident. He was as polite as he could be in public about saying that the lady, in fact, had lied on the situation or exaggerated, or however you want to put it. He was just as polite as he could be, but Mr. and Mrs. Storer had to go. The United States, the Pope, everybody had to be reassured that the President of the United States wasn't going around lobbying in church politics, as indeed he wasn't. You can go over the evidence and so on. 4 pages are devoted to that. You see, it was a very embarrassing incident in the Roosevelt administration, a very embarrassing thing for TR, naturally. What's he supposed to do? How can he, in public, have this lady as an adversary? Here, she's destroying her husband's own career. And a personally painful situation because TR had been a close friend of the Storers for many years, and it was the end of their friendship. So it was a very sad thing brought up by a very silly thing that an old lady did. 4 pages to that. Well now, how many pages do you suppose Mr. Pringle devoted to conservation? Less than 1. Less than 1. You'll find it parts of pages 430 and 431. There's a little bit at the bottom of 430. He goes up the top of 431. Not mentioned are the fact that TR created the first federal bird preserves, the first federal game preserves, that he passed the National Monuments Act, that he created various national parks. None of that is even mentioned at all, but you get in glittering detail all about Mrs. Bellamy Storer. You see the point? What he tells you about Mrs. Storer is quite true. That's all true, but he is interpreting his evidence, and he finds Mrs. Storer more important than national parks, conservation, soil erosion, the saving of endangered species, and so on. This is the way he's working. Frankly, I think there was a generational element to this conflict at this point, because I think TR was Dad's hero. I think TR was Dad's hero for the people coming up in the 1920s and 1930s and even the 1940s. So he was old hat, and you all knew that Dad was all what, and what did he know? And I think there was an element of rejection that way. There's often that kind of generational conflict in intellectual circles as well as in families. Now, one of the main themes of Pringle's book is that politics as a profession is at best ridiculous and at worst extremely dangerous. And sure, but of course that, so who's to run the country, who's to run for office, and so on and so on. He leaves that question unanswered. But basically he finds TR's whole calling in life, what he devotes his time to, is essentially ridiculous. Typical of the kind of disillusionment of the generation of the 1920s and the 1930s. And when I look at Kesselring, too, Kesselring intended no harm. He intended no harm. This was a very great play, a very funny play. It is hilarious. It ran on Broadway. It opened January 10, 1941. Had a great cast, great movie. Have you seen the movie? Cary Grant, Josephine Hull, Boris Karloff, Peter Lorre. It's terrific. And because it's a comedy and all the characters are painted with broad brush, it is the easiest play to perform going. That's why it's been performed virtually in every high school and amateur theatrical group in the United States. It's also been a TV special like 3 different times. Because you see, Teddy Brewster is this insane man who thinks he's TR as opposed to Napoleon or somebody else. He blows a bugle, he runs up the stairs, he yells charge, he says bully about twice every 5 seconds. He's burying bodies in the basement who he thinks are yellow fever victims from the Panama Canal. He goes on and on and on and on. And of course, he's kind of ridiculous. Now, David McCullough, one of our finest writers today, speaks of seeing Arsenic and Old Lace as a boy, with his older brother, by the way, playing the role of TR at a high school in Pittsburgh. And he speaks of this as, quote, his first encounter with Theodore Roosevelt. He's not joking. He's not joking. You see, that's what, he's a little boy. And this is the image he's getting out. It's not Mount Rushmore, it's Arsenic and Old Lace. It's Teddy Brewster, not Theodore Roosevelt. He says this in all seriousness in his current bestseller, Mornings on Horseback, quote, I came away with pretty much the impression of our 26th president that so many of us have grown up with. Short the impression, whether you read Pringle or went to see Arsenic and Old Lace, it's all the same. I might add that Pringle was, in my opinion, a very talented writer. So was Kesselring, and so was Richard Hofstadter. Just a word about Richard Hofstadter. He says it's hard to see how TR managed to keep his reputation as a strenuous reformer. I mean, I just don't know what he wants. Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, trust busting. I mean, I just don't know what the man wants. I think, the point is, if he read Pringle, of course, he wouldn't have heard much about the National Monuments Act because it's not mentioned in the book. Now, see, he should have known better, but he was really carried away by the ideological trends of his time. All of this in the debunking period reminds me of what Theodore Roosevelt himself said in his famous address, History as Literature, which he delivered as his inaugural address as president of the American Historical Association. Yes, he was a historian himself, in 1912. And he wrote, quote, if great events lack a great historian, and a great poet writes about them, it is the poet who fixes them in the mind of mankind, so that in aftertime importance, the real has become the shadow, and the shadow the reality. Shakespeare has definitely fixed the character of Richard III, of whom ordinary men think and speak, unquote. And here he had not found, as I say, the great biographer, the great historian in the first period of historiography. TR had not attracted such a man, such a biography had not been written. And in this second period, as it happens, coincidentally or however, the people who are against TR are great talents, are like poets. And you know, many people will tell you that the Richard III presented in Shakespeare's play is not at all like the real Richard III. But for us, Richard III will always be that hunchback who is an evil man. And in many ways, this is what Arsenic and Old Lace and what Pringle have done because of their power of their writing. But now we come to the third period. It's what I call the realpolitik, power and responsibility period. This lasts from the 1950s to the early or mid-1960s. The debunking period was about 1931, dated precisely from Pringle, to roughly sometime in the 1950s. By the way, Hofstadter changes his mind about TR in his later books. The TR that appears in Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which was published, about early 1960, 61, 62, is an entirely different TR than appears in American Political Tradition in 1948. And Hofstadter has seen the evidence, and he shifts with the times. A realpolitik, meaning realistic politics. Power and Responsibility, I take that title from the best biography of TR written of the period, still the best single one-volume total life of TR by William Henry Harbaugh, Power and Responsibility, The Life and Times of Theodore Roosevelt, published in 1961. In reviewing Professor Harbaugh's book, Senator Hubert H. Humphrey wrote at the time, quote, it will no longer be possible to pretend that TR didn't matter or to judge him superficially as historians once did. This period sees the publication, sponsored by my association, by the Harvard University Press, of 8 volumes of Theodore Roosevelt's letters from 1951 to 1954. And I tell you, there's no one who ever spoke for himself better than TR did. And people, scholars, students, undergraduates, people in their studies and in their living rooms began reading what Theodore Roosevelt had actually written in his letters, his private letters. And this raised his reputation very quickly. This was reflected in John M. Blum's book, The Republican Roosevelt, published in 1954, in Howard K. Beale's book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Rise of America to World Power, in 1956, and in George E. Maury's book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Birth of Modern America, published in 1958. Then comes Harbaugh in 61. You see all these books. Now, these are very big historians. Howard K. Beale was one of the biggest historians of his generation. John M. Blum still is. He's chairman of the history department at Yale University today. So these are, George Maury is one of the most respected men of his time, too, and Harbaugh is as well. So these are solid people writing that TR was a solid fellow. Now, in Howard K. Beale's book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Rise of America to World Power, he refuted Dexter Perkins on the Venezuela case point by point. And he showed that there was plenty of evidence to show that TR had given the Kaiser an ultimatum. Now, what he didn't do was put the ultimatum in writing. And he didn't make it public because, of course, he didn't want the Kaiser to be in a situation publicly where everybody's saying, oh, you can't tell me that and I can't tell you that. He wanted to accomplish the removal of the German fleet. That's what he wanted to accomplish. He didn't want to bully the Kaiser in public. And what Perkins found, and it's subsequently been absolutely borne out by the most recent book on the subject, was that TR had all the communications which were necessary at the time between the U.S. Embassy in Berlin and between Washington, and all the stuff in the White House logbook and all that stuff. He had it all removed. The journal in the Berlin embassy stops in mid-sentence. The guy didn't even finish the sentence. What does that mean? It means he was told to drop his pen, put his pen down, stop it. We're going to tell you some things are going on. Here's a briefing and so on. No record of this is going to be made. And so it's sort of, Edmund Morris says, it's sort of like H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. You know, you couldn't see him, but if you took some talcum powder or some flour, he would begin to emerge. Well, there was a big hole in German-American records. And we've now studied the German records in Potsdam as well. They were covering their own tracks. And right after this incident, the German ambassador in Washington gets fired. And he's replaced by one of TR's best friends, Speck von Sternberg, whom TR had known for many years. In short, part of the story on the German side was that the German ambassador had not sufficiently communicated what TR had said. That it was the ambassador, not the Foreign Office in Berlin, that really hadn't taken TR too seriously. So since this was the case, and since they had gotten the second message, this guy was not good to have in Washington. So they put someone who would really know what TR was all about. And since TR had like a fleet that he was willing to use against the Germans if push came to shove, better have a buddy of TR's, somebody he'd gone riding with and so on, representing Germany. The evidence is really overwhelmingly there. And there is really no reason to doubt TR's word. No reason unless you find him pathologically untrustworthy. And the man who wrote most recently on the subject, Frederick Marx, said, that was the first thing I had to do, to find out what TR's credibility was like. And he tested it on case after case and said he found TR just did not lie. He was not a liar. And particularly watch the way he words something. If he says, for example, in something he writes, I do not see how I can be mistaken about this. You can generally be pretty sure that he's saying, and that if he says, I can't altogether recollect, he will say that. You know, he's usually very precise in his use of words, like a man who wrote over 50 books might well be thought to be, because he had practiced writing and expressing himself. So the second period saw TR put back into the ascendancy. It was also the period in which TR's home in Oyster Bay, New York, was open to the public, Sagamore Hill, in 1953. And thousands and thousands, rather tens of thousands of people begin to go to Sagamore Hill and begin to know about TR and rediscover him all over. I was one of those people. I went there the first summer it was open. I was 9 years old. Then there was the great centennial of TR's birth in 1958. And in 48 states, there were commissions. 48 states, there were commissions to honor TR's 100th birthday. Speeches, programs, parades, and so on. And Congress appropriated money to build a giant memorial to Theodore Roosevelt on Theodore Roosevelt Island in Washington, D.C. That monument was dedicated on his birthday in 1967. So you see, TR was up. But no sooner was he up than there was a quick, almost kamikaze-like attack upon him. And that's the fourth period, the attack by the New Left in the 1960s and going into the 1970s. There is a new precipitous decline of TR's reputation. After it's gone up, it suddenly plummets down again because of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights controversy, the rise of the New Left, and the crises with the so-called imperial presidency. When Americans find themselves threatened by a strong, powerful presidency, then they begin to look back and say, well, he's the guy who invented the modern presidency and the strong presidency, hence Watergate is TR's fault. Well, I mean, that's silly, isn't it? But you have that kind of tendency. No one is going to say that flat-footedly, but that's hinted at in more than a few scholarly works. Now, civil rights. Civil rights for blacks was not a concern of TR's generation. There were not many people interested in it. It was not a major issue. It's always been an issue to some degree. It was not a major issue, and it was not a major issue that concerned TR. He didn't do much about that. So naturally, if you're thinking that's the most important thing, and it was in the 1960s, and rightly so, you're going to say, well, then he's not so great because he didn't pay much attention to it. Of course, TR couldn't have done much of anything about, for example, segregation in his own era because segregation was upheld by the Supreme Court. Hence, any legislation would have been declared ineffective. He did, and when he had power to do so by federal order, he kept integration. The government departments and bureaus in Washington, D.C. were integrated under TR. Under Woodrow Wilson, by the way, they were resegregated. But you see, it wasn't something that interested him that much. It was not something he was involved in. So, once again, his reputation begins to decline. Vietnam War, once again, they say, well, TR was very bellicose, wasn't he? And he was in favor of a big navy, and he was an imperialist, wasn't he? And so, therefore, Vietnam is like the kind of thing he would have done, so people began to attack him again. By the way, I might add, the great civil rights controversy of TR's time was, of course, women. The votes for women and rights for women. And there TR was. And think about it. I've never seen this written down in so many words and in any history book. But you know, TR is the first really prominent male in the United States to come out in favor of women's suffrage. He did so after he was president. It was one of the big planks in the 1912 campaign when he ran on the Bull Moose Party. But he was certainly well in advance of most males of his period on the subject of women's rights, which was the big civil rights controversy of his own time. Most of the books of this period aren't really worth discussing, in my opinion, with the possible exception of Gabriel Kolko's book, Triumph of Conservatism, a reinterpretation of American history 1900 to 1916, which was published in 1963. And from a New Left perspective, it tried to discredit TR's domestic legislation. Well, I've been through that book case by case, and the guy uses evidence so sloppily that you just can't give him much credit. I mean, he leaves out whole segments. I've particularly studied him on the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And on the Meat Inspection Act, for example, in his account of it, he mentions there was a fight over it in Congress, and TR met with guys, and then they made a bargain, and they gave on this point and that point, and then the final piece of legislation, which represented to a certain degree compromise, came out. Now, what Kolko does is he mentions every concession that TR made, but mentions none of the gains that he won, which is just absurd. Just absurd. I mean, so it's as if he said, well, the Meat Inspection Act was a terrible law and poorly written. Well, even if you don't know that a lot of the stuff in the Pure Food and Drug Act is good. A lot of the provisions are good and right on and totally opposed to what the opponents of the bill wanted. You can certainly see one thing, and that is, before TR was there was no Meat Inspection Act, period. Now, I'll tell you something else. It wasn't until the late 1940s that we really substantially improved upon Theodore Roosevelt's Meat Inspection Act of 1906. So maybe it wasn't such a bad job after all. By 1906, Germany was not admitting our beef because it didn't have proper sanitary standards. That's how bad off things were. And TR got a law. Gabriel Coco never got a law. Now we come, this period, this attack by the New Left was rather brief and passed away in the early 1970s. And now we come to the fifth and present period, which I will call the rise of Theodore Roosevelt, after what I guess is certainly one of the two finest books of this revival. It's from the mid-1970s on. We see, and it's interesting that the popular fervor for TR almost precedes the books in this case, because Time magazine put TR on the cover of a special issue on the presidency in 1976. That was in September 1976, because somehow he seemed to epitomize for them all that was best about the presidency. And of course, in 1979, TR appeared on the cover of Newsweek. Not bad for a dead guy. I mean, to be on both Time and Newsweek within a few years. By the way, it was his second appearance on Time magazine's cover. He had been on there on his 100th birthday in 1958. Incidentally, this is a distinction he holds with Jesus Christ and Abraham Lincoln, because, of course, Newsweek and Time generally have living people on their covers. And we see a whole flood of books coming out, a flood which is not abated now. My own book on the Progressive Party, The Bull Moose Years, was one of the first. I'm proud to say, in 1978, helped explain TR's action in his later years after he left the White House. Then came, of course, the great book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris, published in 1979, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, winner of the American Book Award, a great, great book from every standpoint, historical, literary, and so on. It's like riding a train through the Rockies, as one critic says. You know, and you go around the corner, and the next view is better than the next. And it's exciting, and it's got pace and movement. It's a thick book, but no one complains about that. One thing, he's got everything. His chapters are very short, so it goes like that, and you can easily pick it up and put it down. But it also has got terrific pace and terrific color. It's interesting to note that Edmund Morris is an immigrant to this country. He was born in Kenya and educated and came to this country from England in 1968 when he didn't know any American history. And he's learned all of his American history since then, and he therefore brings a great deal of excitement to it, because in a real sense he has discovered Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't come in with a lot of images in his mind already. And he communicated that excitement, I think, very well. And then his wife, Sylvia Jukes Morris, wrote what was the first biography ever of Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, Portrait of a First Lady, Edith Kermit Roosevelt. She's now doing a biography of Clare Boothe Luce. And Edmund is at work on the second of what will be 3 volumes of this massive life, and I think will be the definitive biography of Theodore Roosevelt. Then we have the book that I spoke of before, Frederick W. Marx III, Velvet on Iron, which is a variation on the old speak softly and carry a big stick idea. Velvet on Iron, The Diplomacy of Theodore Roosevelt, published in 1979. This vindicates, with beyond a shadow of any dispute now, TR's own account of the Venezuela affair, and says that he really did mean it when he said, "I believe in speaking softly and carry a big stick." He had spoken so softly on the Venezuelan situation. No one was let in it, no leaks to the press. He did not want war. He wanted to avoid the confrontation, but he carried a big stick. That was Admiral Dewey. It's also one of the other confirmations is quite simply, Admiral Dewey was ordered to steam down with the fleet and be ready off of Puerto Rico for a quick dash. So Admiral Dewey knew full well what this was all about. But Dewey had like sealed orders, and Dewey was not told specifically until the time came. That's how TR handled it. He also very much vindicated, Frederick Marx did, TR's policy in Panama, and also his policy, which was often disputed, to do with the Canadian border dispute. And finally, we have the great masterpiece, another great masterpiece of the current Roosevelt revival, which we are in the midst of, David McCullough's book, published this year, Mornings on Horseback. I think the interesting thing about Mornings on Horseback, it's about TR as a person. It's not really about his political career. Edmund Morris gives you the regular biography with due amounts of private life and public life and all that sort of thing. David McCullough is entirely interested in TR as a human being and his family as human beings. He's not particularly, he said it was the kind of book he would write as if they never became anything important historically, as human beings. And what he has done in effect is recover TR as a hero for our times by making that hero credible, rather like the play Yesterday did. You see TR struggling with asthma, struggling with fear, and with problems of getting up. And of course, he isn't the biggest and the best, and he doesn't become Rocky overnight or something like that, but he does keep at it. He loses that fight at Harvard, but he does keep at it, and he does gradually build himself up. And there's something heroic, if not heroic, if you don't like that word, let's try admirable, let's try likable, let's try winsome with the character you saw as TR yesterday. And that's the kind of TR who is presented in Mornings on Horseback. So we've, in a sense, come full cycle, only now we have a reason for putting TR on Mount Rushmore. Solid scholarship behind this assessment, and we're not finished yet, because there are a great many aspects of his life and his career which we still need to study. By the way, last year, I've only mentioned several of the books. Last year, there were 3 books written on Theodore Roosevelt, 1980. There was Thomas G. Dyer's book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Idea of Race, which talked about his racial attitudes. A guy named Gibson, book on TR and the humorists, the views of 3 humorists, William Dean Howells, Mark Twain, and Finley Peter Dunn towards TR. And the 3rd book is A.A. Norton, simply called Theodore Roosevelt, which is all about TR as a writer, just about TR as a writer. And also the first biography of his wife, and also a novel. That's all last year. That's all 1980. 1981, we get another novel, and we've gotten David McCullough, and there are more books on the way, I assure you. So we are yet to be even within sight of the end of this 5th and present period of historiography, which I think can be titled most aptly, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. So that's the image of the man as he's come down to us. And I would like to now turn to some of the things which I think have not been completely understood or communicated yet. I think they will be, but not yet in the books on TR. I think there are particularly 5 aspects of the reality which is Theodore Roosevelt, which I think one must take into account in understanding TR. Now, as you'll see, some of the problems here when I tell you what they are, because some of them are things that historians do not like to deal with, and for good reason, because they're the kind of things that historians feel it's not their business to deal with. You see what I mean in a minute. These 5 aspects are as follows. Theodore Roosevelt was, 1, a Renaissance man. 2, he was a professional politician. 3, he was a master of the arts of government. 4, he was a great teacher and prophet of democracy. 5, he was a heroic human being. Renaissance man, that means, all-rounded. The naturalist John Burroughs said Theodore Roosevelt was a many-sided man, and every side was like an electric battery. Such copiousness, such thoroughness have seldom been united in one man. And TR was indeed a writer, a historian, a naturalist, an explorer, a cowboy, a conservationist, a political philosopher, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and so on. He wrote over 50 books. He wrote The Definitive History of the Naval War of 1812. He wrote a book called The Winning of the West, which is in 4 volumes, and which is one of the 5 major works in American history produced in the last quarter of the 19th century. That's the history of the frontier. He was a naturalist from childhood. He collected over 5,000 mammals for the Smithsonian Institute in Africa in 1909. He was a taxidermist from childhood on. He discovered a river in Brazil, charted it, size of the length of the Hudson River in New York. It's now known as the Rio Roosevelt, or sometimes in Portuguese, I think more charmingly, as the Rio Teodoro. And on that expedition in 1914, in Brazil, he collected 2,500 birds and 500 mammals for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. One of the last articles he wrote before he died was on Florida sea turtles. He was a professional naturalist in many ways. He also wrote history, and he was president of the American Historical Association. He was a man of many parts. He was, of course, a soldier, a leader of the Rough Rider Regiment. He had his own ranch in the Dakotas. So he was a many-sided man. Secondly, he was a professional politician. He was proud of being a politician, and he thought that the American people should be judged by the quality of their politicians, because after all, who the heck picked them? Who hired them? And he grew up in a time when professional politicians came to dominate our government, pushing aside the old aristocrats like the Roosevelts, who had basically run the nation since colonial days. And he said, when he went into politics, he wanted to be part of the governing class. And he believed that if the profession of politician was necessary to running this country, which it is, then therefore it must be capable of being moral and decent and patriotic and so on. Otherwise, let's go to another form of government. Now today, the word politician, you say, oh, he's nothing but a politician, or he's a mere politician, or he's a politician, simply like that. Almost the word is a pejorative in itself. T.R. would never have approved of that, and he believed that he gave honor to his profession. That's what he did almost his entire life. All these other things he did, he preferred politics. This was the great love of his life. He was elected to the New York legislature in 1881 at the age of 23, and he was in politics right up until the time of his death some 40 years later. So he was a professional politician. He was also a master of government, a master of government. Now, he was a civil service commissioner from 1889 to 1895. He was head of the New York City Police Department from 1895 to 1897. He was assistant secretary of the Navy from 1897 to 1898. Guess what that is? He was a bureaucrat. He was a bureaucrat. And if there's any other word that's a swear word by itself or a pejorative by itself, it's bureaucrat, just like politician. But you read these accounts of his work in the civil service reform, and it's just as exciting as the stuff he did out west when he captured the boat thieves, for example. When he led roundups with the cowboys for his herds and so on. He makes it exciting, and he put it on the front page. There have been civil service commissioners in this country since 1883, but T.R. is the only one anyone remembers. He wasn't Secretary of the Navy, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Yet no one remembers today who was Secretary of the Navy. And I talked to the Secretary of the Navy a few years ago, and he was under the impression that T.R. had been Secretary of the Navy and had a big portrait of him in his office. Very few people remember any police commissioners of New York. The names, the current one maybe, and maybe the guy before that. All the policemen in New York City, and I know because I live in the area, are very conscious of that, and they are very proud of it, that T.R. was once police commissioner. In short, he took the humdrum business of government, the stuff that is necessary to running a modern, complex society. Now, whether we should have, a little bureaucracy or a lot of bureaucracy, or what kind of bureaucracy we should have, that's something else. But bureaucracy of some sort and to some degree we've got to have. Because all it means is organization and system. And T.R. was a bureaucrat, and he made it exciting. He was also very good at it because he was, as I say, a master of the arts of government. When he was president of the United States, he did a great deal for conservation, for example. The Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, involving 28 projects, 3 million acres, including a section along the Trinity River here in Texas, including Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. He created 5 national parks, which doubled the number of national parks. He increased our national forest reserves by 450%. He created 51 federal bird preserves. First was Pelican Island off the east coast of Florida in 1903. He saved the buffalo from extinction by starting a seed herd in Yellowstone Park. He created the first federal game preserve in 1905. He passed the National Monuments Act of 1906, by which he declared as forever invaluable, you can't touch them, you can't hurt them, certain natural wonders in this country, 16 in all, including, and listen to this list, Muir Woods, Mount Olympus, Devil's Tower, Petrified Forest in Arizona. Where would we be without this? Where would we be? He called the first conference of governors in 1908 to talk about the objective of conservation, which led to the appointment of 41 state conservation commissions. In all, he appointed 4 separate study commissions on conservation, one on public lands, one on inland waterways, one on national conservation. The national conservation one was the first inventory of natural resources, and finally a commission on country life, which had to do with farmers. And by the way, none of these commissions cost us 1 red penny, because he got existing employees of the government and volunteers to do all the work for those commissions. And he pointed out, and I've been talking about the expansion of government activity here in conservation. I could also tell you similar things about other areas of government. For example, the meat inspectors that inspected the meat. That's an expansion of federal authority. But T.R. pointed out something in his autobiography, which is, to my knowledge, never been repeated or mentioned by any historian since. Quote, one thing is worth pointing out. During the 7.5 years of my administration, we greatly and usefully extended the sphere of governmental action, and yet we reduced the interest-bearing debt by more than $90 million. To achieve a marked increase in efficiency and at the same time an increase in economy is not an easy feat, but we performed it. He was efficient. In short, he was a master of government. That's on the human level, too. He always brought out the best in people. He always brought out the best in people. You got a lot of guys you could study, and the high point of their life is when they're associated with TR. That's when they did their best work and so on. Later, not so much. Before, not so much. He brought out the best in people. Then he was, of course, a teacher and prophet of democracy. He preached about responsible citizenship. He brought about a synthesis of our great tradition of Hamiltonianism and our great tradition of Jeffersonianism, that is to say, nationalism, efficient federal government, and combined that with the belief in democracy by using Hamiltonian ends for Jeffersonian means, that is to say, that big government, that nationalism, that governmental power, that the presidency would work for the ends of democracy, not for oligarchy or business. So he created a synthesis out of our great tradition as a teacher, out of these 2 great and opposing traditions, one coming down from Alexander Hamilton, one coming down from Thomas Jefferson. Finally, of course, he was a heroic human being. A heroic human being. This is evident, and you saw that in the play yesterday, his struggles as a child with asthma. He said, when I was a little boy, I was afraid of almost everything. And what I did was I pretended that I wasn't. I pretended that I wasn't, and later it was true, I wasn't. You see, he just tried awfully hard. By the way, he was not a hard man. He was very sweet, very sentimental, very much a lover of children. He had 6 children and so on. But there was a heroic aspect. By the time he was in his 20s, he really knew not fear. It just didn't enter into his calculations about anything. He used to play a game, up, over, through, but never around. He taught that to his kids. So they would go across country. You came to a house, you had to climb straight over it, and so on. Or if there was a fence, you could go under it. Or through it, if it were a thicket or a swamp. Never around it. Very typical. And of course, he was teaching a lesson by that game. You know what happened in 1912 when he was shot, campaigning for president on the Bull Moose ticket. He was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, October 14th, 1912. And he was shot by an insane anti-third term fanatic. The bullet went right in here, just under the nipple and just beyond the ribs, and stopped short. Fortunately, he'd had a metal glasses case inside his coat and a folded speech, which was about that thick. He always had small type pages. And so that stopped the bullet from going further. Otherwise, it was headed on a sideways trajectory past the lungs and the heart. He fell down when he was shot. He got up. He said, "Bring the man here." They were getting ready to lynch him from a lamp pole. And he said, "Bring him here." And he protected him until the cops came and took him away. He coughed. No blood came up. He said to himself, "It's probably not a lung. It probably haven't been hit the lung. Otherwise, it'd be hemorrhaging out of the mouth. It wasn't an organ or I would have fainted. So it's either, well, low down in the lung and filling up and I'll be dead in a couple of hours and there's nothing they can do, or it's somewhere in there and hasn't touched the lung or the organs and I certainly can bleed for a couple of hours." All this, he later explained, had gone through his mind like that. So he said, "Let's go on to the speech." And he said, and no doctors to examine him, because then he'd lose his credibility. Then he'd really know what the case was. See? But he wanted, credibility, because he could be just about to die. So no microphone, in this huge hall in Milwaukee. He spoke for 1 hour and a half, standing there bleeding, before he went to the hospital for an hour and a half. First thing he did was he opened the coat, says, "Takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And he says, "It doesn't matter if I die now. I've already had the happiest life of any man I've ever known. I'm ahead of the game anyway." And he went on and he said, "Unless we work together, rich and poor together, all races, all classes together, one for all and all for one, incidents such as this tonight will become commonplace in our political life." He was a heroic human being. 3 years ago, I was seated with one of TR's cousins, a lady who's still with us, 90 years old, with David McCullough. And David McCullough was interviewing her. And she, of course, 90 years old, she had known Theodore Roosevelt well. He says, "What was it like being with him?" She said it was like having a current of electricity in the room. It was like a vibrancy when he walked into the room. And then he said to her, "What was his greatest contribution, do you think, to the United States? Trust busting? Panama Canal? Conservation?" She said, "No, himself." And I think very much so. That's true. Now, that's the problem with historians, because we're not supposed to deal in that stuff. That stuff's to do with our country, with patriotism, with spiritual values, and so on, and that's not the business of historians. It's the business of somebody else. So there's a part of TR that a lot of professional historians will always have to back off from, and rightly so, because that is his greatest contribution, himself. And I'd like to close by sharing with you a piece of himself, a piece that was written really for you, because these were words that Theodore Roosevelt spoke in Dallas, Texas, on April the 5th, 1905. And I might add, taking off my hat as an historian, that in what he says here, I humbly join him in seconding all the sentiments in this speech. He said, "It has been indeed a pleasure for me to come today within the limits of your mighty and beautiful state." He said, "No people more than the Texans have rendered it impossible for this country to be anything but great. It is not open to us to choose whether we shall play a small part or a great part. Your fathers helped to make that choice impossible. Play a great part we must. All that we can decide is whether we shall play it well or ill." He said, "The problems change. One generation faces different difficulties from the difficulties faced by its predecessors. But the spirit in which those problems must be faced is forever the same. The outward problem changes. The outward means of solving that problem changes. But the heart of the man who is to solve it cannot be changed." He said, "I want you men of Texas to see to it that exactly as you lift your heads higher because of what your fathers have done, so your children have the right to hold their heads higher because of the way in which you handle yourselves." He said, "A glorious memory is the best of all things for a nation, if it spurs that nation on to try to rise level with that memory. It is a poor thing for a nation if it uses the memory of the past to excuse it for inaction or failure in the present." He said, "Remember always that this life is certain to contain much that is hard, much that is unpleasant. I do not believe that we ought ever to try to delude ourselves with the thought that we can make life easy, effortless, and yet keep it worth having. For a nation, as for an individual, the life is the life of effort. You have made this great state of Texas what it is because your forefathers had in them the spirit which recognized in a difficulty something not to be flinched from, but to be overcome. He said in closing, we say in closing, I cannot sufficiently thank you for the way you have greeted me today. I am more touched than I can express. I shall go away with the feeling that after all, while there are differences among us, the fundamental fact is that wherever you find the average American is a pretty good man. It is our unity, not our divergency, that is the great fundamental fact of our national life. I shall go away a stronger and a better American for having been in this state of strong and good Americans, this mighty Commonwealth of Texas. Thank you.
Gable for that inspired and magnificent address. And I think I should say on behalf of all of us, we think it was bully of you and President Roosevelt to share this week. Thank you again.